Classicism is ubiquitous, salted into the Western canon and jogging our senses every day in the stratum of Latinate borrowings in the English language, or the Roman fonts of newspaper print, or taking its form as subversive guerrilla weaponry in the 18th century landscape of Stowe Gardens, or the more contemporary polemics of Ian Hamilton Finlay. Lutyens' Cenotaph, the Bank of England, and the Parthenon marbles go on speaking this language to us, and they are no more incoherent or closer to obsolescence now than when they were first created. Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're delighted today to be joined by three very highly esteemed guests: Francis Terry, who's been on our podcast before, George Saumarez Smith, and Ben Pentreath, all of whom are perhaps the foremost classical architects and designers in the country today, if not the world. And we're delighted to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Don't make everyone cross immediately.
Yeah, sorry, I bet I ought not to. But you are highly respected, and we're very, very grateful that you've had the time to come on today. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Now, today, or this month, is an anniversary, 15th anniversary of a very special exhibition at RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. George, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that exhibition was in 2010, and then we could do some intros for each of you.
Yeah, so it sort of came about in, I guess, maybe 18 months before the exhibition. So we're talking late 2008. And every year I used to do a drawing for the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition. And they would normally hang them. The nice thing about the architecture room in the Royal Academy is that it had a bit of everything in it. It was very eclectic. And I just heard that they'd rejected my drawing. So I rang Francis and said, "Did you submit a drawing for the Royal Academy?" And he said, "Yes, and yours was also turned down." Mm-hmm. And then we thought...
I didn't.
So we were a bit despondent. And then we thought, oh, well, maybe we should do a sort of Salon des Refuses, do a kind of rival exhibition. And then very quickly got in touch with Ben and said...
Did I submit?
Is it something that he would be interested in doing?
Competition, you can't win. One of my rules.
And so opened in May 2010.
And it opened in 2010, and it was called Three Classicists. I mean, I think actually, Francis, you came up with the name. I think we sort of weren't sure what it was going to be called. At one stage, we thought it might be called Facade, and then. You said we should just do it. It should do what it sort of says on the tin.
Exactly, just play with a straight bat. Just Three Classicists.
A bit like the Country House podcast says what it is on the
tin.
Yeah, exactly. It's so useful. People sort of have exciting names, but it's best not.
Yeah, agreed. And so it was the three of you. So why don't you each tell us a little bit about who you are, for those who aren't familiar. Francis?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think what's in a way more interesting is how we all met, really.
Yeah.
I'm Quinn and Terry's son, and I was working in my father's office, and George, you came along and worked at the same time, but I've also known George forever because George is a grandson of Raymond Erith, my father's partner.
Oh, so I didn't know that.
So
who owned the house that you now live in, Francis?
Exactly, okay. Yeah. So it's a very small world.
Oh, yeah.
And then, Ben, you used to come and visit George when you were working.
We were friends.
This was in
we were friends at university.
Mid-90s,
yeah.
and you're university friends.
Yeah.
So that's basically how we all met.
So
do you want a full?
And then what's nice
So
is that you realise that you're not the only sort of weird freak who's interested in traditional architecture, because at the time, I think in the 90s, it felt quite countercultural, being a classical or a traditional architect.
Yeah,
You can feel quite isolated if you're not in this sort of.
Yeah. I mean, when we
world,
went to architectural school, and it's probably still the
I didn't
case.
go to architecture
No, you didn't.
school.
But,
I'm not an architect.
But
before
it's
somebody complains.
You're an architectural designer.
Proving you don't need to be an architect.
Well,
the amount of times I've said, one of the most successful architects in the country is not an architect. But no, at the and you, no, but it was. You couldn't do. I started when I went to Cambridge doing classical schemes, and they just thought I was an idiot. I worked quite hard in my first year and got a 2-2, and I thought that's a bit of a waste of time. So I then did modern, and I wasn't very good, but I got a 2-1, so that was nice. But I mean, it was not. I actually think classical architecture is quite cool now because everyone's stick to the back teeth with modern architecture now.
Yes.
It's interesting, isn't it? I was speaking to someone yesterday who was saying that there seems to be a renewed interest, certainly in traditional architecture or traditional styles, more so than there was in the 90s, perhaps.
But you guys have also been instrumental, I think, in that process. I mean, there was the generation before, which was people like John Simpson who were kind of pushing ahead, and then you guys have, I think, taken on the baton and made it quite cool, and meant that a lot of my generation, even though they don't know much about architecture, all know exactly who you are and think it's
I think
amazing.
there were a number of things we wanted to do. One of the things, as we've said, is that we're sort of bound together by friendship and working together, even though ultimately we are rivals. We're competing for the same work.
We're actually a cartel.
Architectural mafia.
So it's quite unusual. I think that the generation older than us, there are a number of architects who would definitely not be friends.
You couldn't actually get some of them to do a podcast like this because they wouldn't be in the
Do you think that was because there was less
time.
work in those days and therefore that it was more competitive?
No, it's a personality disorder.
But I actually think it was to do with they felt like this kind of hated minority, and that gives you a kind of aggressive personality. Whereas we've always been very calm. We've always assumed we're accepted, even if we're not, which is quite a good way of being. Yeah. But I mean, I've learned stacks from both of you. I mean, I think what I've learned from George is you don't have to be clever. But I remember you drawing the kind of dumbest facades. This was in the mid-90s, and you say, I'm very happy with that. And that was such a revelation, actually.
Well, you don't have to overcomplicate it.
You don't have to overcomplicate it. Door in the middle, 2 windows either side, nice little eaves, done. Chimney in the middle. That was because I think at university, particularly with the only thing in a way that modernism has taken from classicism is the kind of hero genius thing. Like Picasso is very much in that realm that you have to be a genius. But you very much had that. And that was so don't leave Ben out. Well, your drawings are absolutely amazing, obviously.
Well, this links because
I think another thing I took from you, I remember hearing you talking about repetition in buildings, how Georgian housing developments, whether it's Belgrave Square,
it's in the catalogue.
It's in the catalogue.
It
just repetition is good, and that was a revelation because you were always thinking, oh, the trouble is that these Stalinesque blocks, they're all monoliths or whatever. They just didn't have a Corinthian order.
Well, there's a wonderful video, isn't there, of you guys at the Three Classicists doing a drawing together in time lapse.
Yeah.
What does that drawing? We'll post a link on our podcast for people to watch that. I think it's on Francis's website.
It's on YouTube.
But it's on YouTube.
It's been watched millions of times.
Is it? What are you drawing together, and how easy was it? Because you're all very talented draftsmen. You all hand draw all your designs, all three of you. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, how was it working together?
Hand draw.
Yeah.
I
don't know.
We planned it out a bit.
I hand draw my designs.
We planned out that drawing, didn't we?
Yes.
We gave it some thought. It had a structure. We sort of mapped it out on the day. Do you remember? We had sort of thought that just before Ben turned up to take the film, how are we going to do this? And we came up with a plan, and then we just started. Kind of started on one side and worked our way through, and then tackled different bits.
And it shows a classical scene. What does it depict?
It's which sort of monumental gateway, isn't it?
Pozzo,
Yeah.
It looks like a sort of Baroque stage set.
Yeah, I think it was one of Pozzo. Pozzo, the ceiling painter who did the Jesu.
But in a way that it was less about the drawing, more as a sort of an event.
Yeah.
The people came to watch us doing it, and then when it speeded up, it's sort of about 2 or 3 minutes long. So it looks like we're drawing incredibly fast, which we're obviously not.
No,
but for our listeners, you were doing it in the middle of the exhibition whilst people were wandering around. And that was that made it very immersive.
But it was it was actually. What it was really about is showing that the three of us were friends and
that's why I got
and a love of drawing. That's actually what the exhibition was about. It was just enjoying the beauty of classical forms and just the joy of drawing.
At the time of the exhibition, the hand drawing part of it, the fact that we had decided to do everything kind of exhibiting a lot of drawings, which partly suited us because we had more drawings than we had actual sort of completed buildings in our own name at the time. But everybody loves drawings. I mean, it's sort of, it's kind of one of the weird things, but everybody loves a drawing. It's like, oh, how beautiful is a drawing. But it was actually one of the things which I think at the time, well, you've got the Architect's Journal on drawing, whatever the cover is. But it's sort of, the broader architectural community who measured drawings, who arrived at the RIBA to see what all of the fuss was about. Everybody can get behind a beautiful bit of hand drafting. Yeah. Even if, mentally or philosophically, you're a deeply stripped contemporary minimalist architect, everybody can appreciate something drawn or made by hand, which is, it was a very interesting part of it. So I think that was something which the whole big drawing for the day thing was really trying to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I got the idea, or the first sort of germ of the idea was a story I heard where at my university, Le Corbusier and Henry Moore did a drawing together at the architectural faculty in Cambridge.
Yeah,
on a massive piece of paper.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And Sandy Wilson, the professor who's done the British Library, he said to a student, just roll that up and keep it somewhere. And it got lost.
Oh, no.
But I just think it's really fun to have drawings by a group of architects.
I think it is in the RIBA drawings collection.
It is somewhere. In the RIBA, yeah.
That's all right then.
So,
thank God.
So circling back, the Three Classicists, can we sort of in a nutshell to our listeners explain sort of what classicism is? What is it that makes you classical designers or architects as opposed to something else? I know you're traditional and you do other styles as well, arts and crafts or whatever, but what is it, firstly, what classicism is, and secondly, why do we take so many lessons from classical architecture and apply them to all sorts of designs, not just, like contemporary designs often use some of the same proportions or whatever. Why is it that classicism is so important in architecture, really?
Shall I answering that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what we would call classical architecture is derived from Greek and Roman antiquity, but then goes through a whole series of revivals, so Renaissance architecture and neoclassicism, and in English architecture it really sort of forms the basis for an awful lot of what we would call different forms of traditional architecture. The sort of basis of it are different column types, 5 different columns, which are they're called the orders, and the 5 orders are the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. And so those are the sort of foundations of it.
And they go in order of sort of the most plain to the most flamboyant or elaborate.
Yes. And so obviously familiarity with the orders is an important part of what we do, but not all buildings have columns on them and layers of the orders. And so it's also understanding when to hold back and when to use them. And I think for me, one of the things that's so exciting about using the classical language is that it goes back so far and it has layers of meaning and symbolism in it, as well as very, very sort of highly developed sense of what is beautiful. And so it's a very expressive language.
Yeah, I think that is that's one of the real joys of working in the classical language, is that when you're doing, say, a volute, and you're trying to work out how much the volute should project, how much should the abacus come out, where does it sit in relationship to the column shaft. Someone thousands of years ago was thinking exactly the same thing, and it sends a shiver down your spine. And I suppose it's interesting. There isn't much for me in modern architecture. There isn't. I don't have that to be sort of in dialogue with people so long ago. It's really is a real thrill.
I'm very keen to know. I mean, it's a language, as you said, and how do you think that your dialect as a generation is different from the dialect of the previous one? And also, how do you think that your dialect, as it were, differs from each other? Because you've all got different styles. What do you think characterises that?
I think it is true that we definitely have different dialects. I would say, Francis, you enjoy more...
I like ornaments.
Ornamented buildings. I'm
You get it.
I'm the ornament man. Anyone wants ornament, that's me.
Well, we're Baroque people, so we
like
that.
Exactly.
I'm definitely more restrained. Sohn has always been one of my sort of heroes. You're I think,
he's not my
William
hero.
Kent.
No,
you're perhaps more John Nash.
Probably.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vanbrugh would be my...
number one.
Yeah.
I feel a fancy dress party coming on.
Rory's writing a
it all went wrong, Francis, in about 1710.
But also Vanbrugh...
It was awful. It was terrible.
Rory could agree.
Too soon to talk about it, really.
Ben, you'd mentioned that you're not a officially formally trained architect, but you do design the most beautiful buildings, and Vanbrugh was an example of someone who wasn't...
no one was trained.
No one was trained in those days, were they?
No.
And so they would... Just
they don't have to get planning.
Buildings, exactly.
Same
It doesn't make any difference.
Well, exactly.
I tell you something on the subject of teaching and all that. Years ago, I helped a modernist architect who just said, I want my students to know how to do classical architecture. And he was just stunned about how easy it was. I just turned up with these students, and they were designing a little rotunda thing. And I said, you got your column too fat, go and look at Palladio for that. You've made this entablature too deep. I suggest looking at Vignola. And I could just tell them what to do. And I think that's a really difficult thing about modernism.
It's all subjective.
Well, it's subjective, but also you're doing it for the first time each time. That all those proportions, they look good 200 years ago. I mean, that's something I get from both of you, is that confidence just to say...
if something hasn't already been done, it's probably not a very good idea.
Yeah, and if you see it and it looks good, it'll look good again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And isn't it interesting that you look at even back in 2,000-3,000 years ago or whatever, when the Romans and the Greeks were building these buildings, that they came up with all sorts of things like, isn't it better for sort of columns to taper slightly near the top to make it look like they don't, for the
Emphasis.
eye,
Yes.
all those sorts of things. What's that called?
Emphasis.
Little things like that, which I suppose was very sort of extraordinary that they thought about that, that long ago, in terms of that they could see. And it's those sorts of things that are applied to all architecture today, I suppose, is little things that we don't notice, that people don't notice, but actually make it pleasing to the eye.
And practical things like drip mouldings and weathering, and
it's very sophisticated compared to a lot of modern architecture now. Cylindrical columns are just ugly compared to a column that tapers from the bottom to the top and has a very slight curve on it.
Yeah,
it's just.
It's an easily used system. I mean, I suppose why we're all classicists, it's easy, isn't it, on some level?
Well, it's reliable. It's definitely a feature of classicism that even somebody who is not hyper skilled can still produce good results.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an interesting aspect of.
But let's not be too honest. You're all very, very skilled and very, very good at what you do at the same time.
Yeah, but it's easy. Kids.
But nevertheless, you go around Bath, shall we say, and you see buildings by, I would say, not especially talented architects that are really beautiful because they use a very well rehearsed set of rules.
Lines. To a certain extent. Yeah, exactly. I think one thing which I would also say, back to the question which you were asking earlier about the dialects that we're speaking, I think all three of us in a way, and others in our generation, I think we feel a lot more confident about not having to speak with a highly original classical voice. I think there's a whole narrative which is actually a modernist narrative to a certain extent, that architecture has always been about a sort of progressing, evolving style, a sort of a pattern of style that started in one place and ended in another, and it's the sort of Pevsner's view of architectural history. It's sort of and in his view, it was ending in modernism. But I think there's a generation of traditional or classical architects who were highly trained in modernism, who were countercultural to the modernist aesthetic, but they still had in their head that in order to be a sort of card-carrying, respectable member of the architectural world, you had to be in some way or another a progressive classicist, because otherwise it's a sort of dead language that is kind of, just bones. But actually I think we've all found, and that's something which really ties us all together, that we have absolutely no fear of copying as closely as possible, kind of specific examples from the past, which just fit the purpose quite well. I think you can always tell that a building is by you or me, and you will always be able to tell for the rest of time that this building was built now, not 100 years or 300 years ago. But there's a sort of confidence that comes from that, and it's actually the confidence that I think a lot of Edwardian architects had as well. Yeah. They were just supremely confident. They weren't troubled by their place in the world, and it means that you've got the ability to just quietly copy, and that's a beautiful thing if you're trying to do something well, because you don't always have to be original.
It also shows a deeper, I suppose, not just humility, but sense of you are creating something beautiful, even if people don't see it and think that's a Ben Pentreath or that's a Francis Taylor, and that's something that takes. That requires you to sacrifice your ego in a way that a lot of modern architects aren't willing to do.
We've got plenty of ego. It's not
so many modern architects, they don't think about how it will appear, how people will feel, the public, when they're walking past a building in the city or whatever. They just want everyone to look at it and say, that's designed by this architect, in a way that, or just function over form. Yeah. Whereas I think there's I always use the example of the building that Quillan did. I don't know if it was with you, of the the Baker Street development, which looks like a row of different Georgian townhouses. Yeah, George. And you walk past it and you don't look at these what appears to be a row of townhouses from different periods. You don't look at that and instantly say that's a George Saumarez Smith or that's a Quillan Terry. You look at it and say that's objectively beautiful. It must have stood here for 300 years, which of course it hasn't. Yeah. But that's lovely, I think, compared to something hideous, but you automatically know that that's the architect, because long term, ultimately, it's I suppose it's short term vanity, but long term, in 200 years' time, theirs won't be standing, whereas yours still will be.
I think, in a way, in fact, I wrote about it in that Three Classicists thing, is that I think that architecture is wrongly paired with sculpture and painting. And it's more like food, it's a domestic art. And, if someone says, that meal was very original or groundbreaking, it's kind of, it wasn't a good meal. And I think what we take seriously is we'll do anything to make the buildings beautiful. And if that means loss of ego on the way, too bad.
But also it's important because buildings are the one thing that people can't help, but people can't avoid. I can choose not to go to the Tate Modern and choose not to see contemporary art if I don't want to, but I can't choose not to walk past a building or drive past a building. And so you have to think, I think, a lot more carefully than just making a statement. If people are forced to live in them or look at them or work in them in a way that you can't. And that links, I suppose, with the country house. The country house theme of this pod is you've all designed country houses of different scales and sizes and styles. But something that they have in common is they're all objectively beautiful and hopefully, therefore, will stand the test of time.
But also highly livable. I mean, something that I think that you guys, I've met various people who are clients of yours and they've all said is that the houses that you design are wonderfully practical and they're homes and they're going to be very sustainable as well. And I'm sure we'll get onto that in a second. But perhaps do you think that because you kind of free up headspace away from trying to be desperately original, that actually you're able to invest more time and energy into making something that really, really works for the person you're building?
I mean, certainly for me, most of my time is occupied by trying to solve problems as elegantly as possible. A lot of it is very, very practical. And again, this is an aspect of classicism that many of the forms are there to...
they're plastic.
To sort of deal with practical matters as well as be aesthetically beautiful. So I didn't really think about architectural style very much. It is actually just problem solving within a language that we're all very familiar with.
No, I mean, I think that we can talk about kind of classicism a lot, but what often makes a building good is getting the drain pipes in the right place and little things haven't been forgotten and all that kind of quite dull stuff that you need someone in the background just to be checking that. I mean, another thing I think that, Rory, you've mentioned before is that even the most classical of houses will have a modern component in it because, we're not living in Georgian times. And, particularly with interiors, you have to do more contemporary interiors and sometimes you work in collaboration with people.
And it's interesting. I know Ben has a double role. You are a full-blown interior designer as well, whereas you're both, you dabble in interiors, but it's not your sort of thing.
I think
is that fair?
Yeah.
Dabble.
Yeah.
I dabble.
I think you've all got exquisite interiors of your own houses, yeah.
Yeah, I've got, yeah.
How do you find that, Ben, in terms of sometimes clients commission you just to do the interiors, sometimes if they commission you to do the architecture, do they normally commission the interiors as well?
Not always, no, by no means. But I would say that it would be unusual for us to work on an old house if we weren't doing the interior decoration, because if you're working with restoring an old building, a townhouse in London or a nice country house somewhere or whatever it might be, for me the decoration side of that is the sort of creative element in the piece. But if we're working on the design of a new building, quite often they might already have somebody who they want to work with as their interior designer, or sometimes the building aspect of it might be something that is architecturally intriguing, but when you find out more about the client's interior decoration taste, you sort of pass on that part of the commission and say, have you heard of
can be quite a nice
X,
place
Y, Z.
to leave, that we leave a project as an architect when it's just missed into.
I was about to say, do you sometimes have to? You don't want to put your name to a design if the client wants to. If the client wants to do something that's too different to what's within your comfort zone, do you sometimes have to say, I think you're best find someone else in terms of architecture?
On the architectural side,
both and interiors.
I've got quite a wide comfort zone on architecture.
You've done more. I mean, I think there's another thing is
contemporary buildings.
That classicism is seen as sort of, for a long time, was set up in opposition to modernism. I think that the three of us are not really that bothered about modernism. It just doesn't do anything. It doesn't set our hearts on fire.
It sets my heart on fire. It does.
But you would definitely do more contemporary things.
Yeah, I mean, I have done anyway. But I think, it's there are a lot of beautiful modernist buildings that I can think of, houses, public buildings, whatever, that really do set my heart on fire. I think that's not the point. The problem with modernism as an architectural philosophy is that it's sort of got a pretty poor success rate. It's very, when it's brilliant, it's completely brilliant. And, it doesn't really matter where you go. If you find yourself in that, I don't know, Louisiana in Copenhagen, it's unbelievable as a building and as a group of buildings in the landscape. And there's no way that a classical, modern, a contemporary classical art gallery would have the same emotive effect. The issue is that for every great, there are a million not greats, not very well designed, churned out by a system. It's a system that has allowed itself to be cheapened. It doesn't have much joy in it in the first place. So if it's built cheaply, it's actually just really depressing. Whereas actually classicism or traditional architecture done cheaply, a vernacular classicism, is still full of joy and beauty. So it's very good at bad stuff, if you see what I mean.
And you all worked in that in terms of you do, exquisite, famous one-off, country houses, but you also do mass developments like at Poundbury or in Scotland. And how are you able to do those to relatively low? Are they could, for example, Barratt Homes, whose buildings aren't have a life expectancy of 30 years.
Probably going into a separate whole issue, but it's complicated.
But it's
probably
possible.
not.
But
probably
what
Barratt is not really capable of this.
producing.
There's a level where you need to spend on a house. I found
it's not to do with cost. It's not to do with finances. It's to do with systems.
Okay.
They're a highly systematized business, so they can't really easily cope with the nuance that we would require in
drawing
the
from the local vernacular.
It's
and
not
stuff
even.
like that.
It's just. It's
But what is interesting, going back to what you guys have done with those developments, is you've created large-scale developments of houses that are inspired partly by the local vernacular and will probably, hopefully, stand the test of time in a way that they are more sustainable. We've talked a lot about the importance of beauty and architecture as a sustainability argument.
And
because,
mental health.
And mental health for sure. But also you look at something like the Georgian townhouse, which is naturally, we know that are incredibly sustainable because the heat rises, they're narrow and tall, and they're all joined together, and they're objectively beautiful and last for 300 years, and therefore are far more sustainable in the long term and cheaper in the long term.
Well, we're persuaded,
But this is and this is the point. How do you think? How can we? So this is slightly off track, but how can we sort of? You've done a great job, all three of you, and this exhibition was important in that, in sort of beginning to shift the public or the narrative in favour of thinking a little bit more about beauty and architecture as an important part of creating sustainable buildings that last. How do you think we can continue that shift? I mean, we can do podcasts like this and write articles and whatever, but how can we change not just public opinion, but political opinion and other things in terms of making people more convinced?
I don't worry about it too much.
You don't worry about it?
I think that, I mean, you it's good that there are people who do worry about it a lot. I mean, I've got good friends. The Prince's Foundation, now the King's Foundation, has been a sort of campaigning organisation for 30 plus years now, and obviously it's a dramatically expanding movement, particularly in the world of housing development. And a lot of the ideas of Poundbury are now, to a certain extent, entering the mainstream. But for every example which is positive, given the huge numbers of housing that the government is projecting that they want to build within this parliament, as each month goes on, it's kind of more and more houses to build in the available time remaining. To be honest, it's probably highly unlikely that many of them will follow the really underlying philosophies of the new urbanist developments. And I just don't worry about that, because if you're trying to change the whole world, that's kind of like a really tough thing to take on. But what I love to do is to just, concentrate really hard
on what you can do,
what is in front of me, which is it's enough to concentrate on that, and actually just getting simple developments out of the ground anywhere in the country that are, better than average is quite a hard task. And we are, we're doing that on lots of different schemes, and it takes a lot of mental energy. So I'm not going to worry about everyone else, because it's too complicated.
I think it's one of the things that characterises all three of you. I mean, you were saying this right at the start. There is a lack of belligerence, a lack of a fight between the modernists and the traditionalists. Now you guys get on with what you do.
Yeah,
you've made it quite popular.
I mean, to a certain extent, in a way, you could sit here with any single architect, practicing today, and have the same podcast about longevity, materials, beauty, sustainability, blah blah blah. I mean, ironically, there are some kind of intriguing people who I chat to from time to time in the architectural world who are like, oh God, sustainability, it's become this kind of like unbelievably like cloying kind of miasma which has spread through architecture schools now, so that as long as something is quote unquote sustainable, whatever that means, actually we no longer need to think about, the good old punchy kind of design stuff that modernists in particular were really going on about in the 60s and 70s.
Which means we're actually getting really
boring.
It's
the ultimate sort of cop-out in a way. There's a totally shared language now. Like, I think the kind of the style wars situation of the sort of very late 70s, early 80s, actually, when you look with the benefit of hindsight, the tipping point had occurred at least 10 or 15 years before, kind of in the late 60s or the early 70s was when the shift really happened. It just took 10 or 15 years to manifest itself, and it took somebody like the then quite young Prince of Wales to just give the final shove into kind of full public kind of glare. But I think it was something which had been going on. It was a shift which had been happening for quite a long time. Then I think after the 80s kind of like real style battles, publications, it sort of weirdly shifted back again. And I think now we're in a world where it would be very hard to find a well-qualified professional architect or landscape architect or town planner who's not going to want to talk about sustainability, walkability, energy, kind of longevity, etc., etc. And the nice thing about what we do is that we're still slightly circumventing that, I think, but we're definitely not in a fight.
I do think
it'd be hard to pick a fight on it now.
Beauty, which we take very seriously, is a sustainable issue. Because if something's ugly, people will just want to pull it down as quickly as possible.
No, I couldn't agree more.
So, taking care to do beautiful things will ensure that they last longer.
Yeah. And actually, although a lot of what we're talking about is accepted amongst practicing architects, classicism, I think, you would still have a very rough ride if you were studying architecture at university, if you suddenly started taking an interest in classical forms. So I think education is a sort of one area which does seem very in need of reform.
I would getting a pitch into the Royal Academy now, I wouldn't even bother.
Yeah, it's actually much worse
because it used to
than it
be
was 15
really
years ago.
easy.
Yeah.
I used to kind of get them in the whole time in the kind of 90s. And that
anymore.
Stopped. Yeah, because now they think
if you're from the Royal Academy, kids, just listen to this podcast.
No, it's very Royal Academy is very easy. You can put
have a
6
think about
pictures
what
in.
you started.
And is that because they accused you of being pastiche with the old
No,
age
they
old?
now theme it so that you can't just put in a really good drawing. They'll say, this year we're doing climate change, next year we're doing this, next year we're doing that. So you can't just say, here's my really nice picture of a country house. They don't like it.
It's hot this year.
Well, we need to sadly wrap up, but thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us today. We will, give you all a plug on our Instagram, and for our listeners, if you want to see what buildings that Ben, George, and Francis have designed or worked on, you can go onto our Instagram. We'll be featuring those. Thank you for your time, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.